Live from New Delhi, you're watching DD India Global. We'll get you the top stories from India and the region. I'm Prasar Bharati, and for news from the rest of the world, I'm joined by my colleague in Washington, Benji Hire. Hello Benji, good to have you with us.
Very good morning. 10 a.m. here in Washington, 3 in the afternoon across Central Europe. Coming up on the show stateside, we'll have all the reaction to Donald Trump's comments yesterday regarding Kamala Harris. Huge backlash to those remarks from the former president, as well as updates from developing stories from across the world. First, though, back to you for the latest headlines.
India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi holds bilateral talks with his Vietnam counterpart Pham Minh Chinh in New Delhi. Several MOUs signed between two nations. Israeli military confirms death of head of Hamas's military wing Mohammad Deif. India issues advisory for its citizens, asks not to travel to Lebanon. And Kremlin says Russia will shoot down Ukraine's F-16 fighter jets even as Russian troops advance in eastern Ukraine. India and Vietnam signed several memorandums of understanding on Thursday aimed at enhancing bilateral relations and regional cooperation in the presence of Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his Vietnamese counterpart Pham Minh Chinh, who is on a 3-day state visit to New Delhi. This came after both leaders held talks to further expand the comprehensive strategic partnership between the two countries, including Hanoi's maritime security.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Vietnamese Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh jointly inaugurate Army Software Park at Telecommunications University, Nha Trang in Vietnam.
हमारी एक्ट ईस्ट पॉलिसी और हमारे इंडो पैसिफिक विजन में वियतनाम हमारा महत्वपूर्ण पार्टनर है। इंडो पैसिफिक के बारे में हम दोनों के विचारों में अच्छा सामंजस्य है। हम विस्तारवाद नहीं, विकासवाद का समर्थन करते हैं।
The Prime Minister of Vietnam, who is on a 3-day visit to India, was accorded a ceremonial reception at the forecourt of Rashtrapati Bhavan, the President's house. Prime Minister Narendra Modi received his Vietnamese counterpart at the Rashtrapati Bhavan. The two leaders shared a warm hug as they greeted each other. He then inspected a guard of honor by the Combined Defence Services. Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Prime Minister Pham Minh held a bilateral discussion joined by high-level delegations of top officials and ministers. The two leaders announced plan of action for the implementation of the comprehensive strategic partnership during the 2024 to 2028 period between the two countries. The two countries have also signed a range of memorandums of understandings to strengthen their relations, which include MOU for cooperation in customs capacity building, MOU for cooperation in agricultural research and education, MOU for cooperation in the legal field, MOU between India's Prasar Bharati and Voice of Vietnam for cooperation on radio and television, $2 credit line agreements of $300 million, letter of intent for conservation and restoration of F block in Mai Son, Quang Nam province in Vietnam, MOU for cooperation in the field of medicinal plants, MOU for cooperation and development of National Maritime Heritage Complex in Gujarat. Vietnam has also announced to join the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure led by India. To highlight the significance of growing ties between their countries, the two leaders spoke about the rich historical and cultural ties along with shared heritage between India and Vietnam.
हमारी साझा सांस्कृतिक धरोहर के संरक्षण के लिए भारत वर्ल्ड हेरिटेज साइट मी सोन के ब्लॉक एफ के मंदिरों के संरक्षण में सहयोग देगा। हम भारत में बुद्धिस्ट सर्किट में वियतनाम के लोगों को आमंत्रित करते हैं और चाहते हैं कि नालंदा विश्वविद्यालय का लाभ वियतनाम के युवा भी उठाएं।
We believe that under the leadership of His Excellency Prime Minister Modi, in his third consecutive term, India would continue to bring about greater benefit to the Indian people, achieve even more splendorous successes in the future, and achieve Viksit Bharat 24/7.
Both India and Vietnam are among the fastest growing economies in the world, sharing similar geopolitical challenges in the Indo-Pacific region. Strengthening of the strategic ties by the two nations is expected to give both the countries an added boost to the Asian bonhomie and India's Act East policy. Akshay Dongre, DD India.
Vietnamese Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh called on India's President Draupadi Murmu at the President's house in Delhi on Thursday. He also called on the Vice President of India, Jagdeep Dhankar, at Vice President's enclave. The two leaders reflected on the diverse aspects of India-Vietnam bilateral relations, with focus on strengthening economic cooperation and people-to-people ties between the two nations. India has advised Indian nationals against travelling to Lebanon in view of recent developments and potential threats in the region. India issues travel advisory to its nationals in Lebanon. Indian Embassy on Lebanon wrote on X that all Indian nationals are strongly advised to leave Lebanon. Those who remain for any reason are advised to exercise extreme caution and remain in constant contact with the embassy. Indian Embassy in Beirut can be reached through email ID visible on your screens or the emergency number +961 76 860 128. Well, a 17-year-old boy charged with murder of 3 young girls in a knife attack in London. DD India's Benji Hai gives us more on this and other stories making headlines around the world. Hi Benji, what do you see the motive behind this attack?
Well, no motive declared at this stage, and this attack taking place in the north of England in the town of Southport, a couple of 100 kilometres away from the capital city of London. What we know is that a 17-year-old boy appeared in court on Thursday charged with the murder of 3 young girls in a knife attack. Dozens of officers standing outside the courtroom after violent protests had broken out in Southport and across the country following the incident. Dozens of arrests made as disorder spread. This after 3 children died from being stabbed whilst they were attending a Taylor Swift-themed dance and yoga workshop. 8 other children suffering injuries. DD India correspondent Stuart Smith has been following this tragic story for us. He joins us live from the UK. Stuart, the attacker appearing in court for the first time earlier. What more do we know about him and this terrible incident?
Well, it's the first time we've heard his name, which is really key in this case. He's been identified as Axel Rudakubana. He is 17 years old, and that has meant that reporting restrictions would usually mean that name cannot be released to the public while this trial is ongoing. But the judge, in making an exception here, due to what the judge said comes down to the public interest in allowing full reporting of these proceedings, and also saying that because he turns 18 in a couple of weeks, there's no practical effect in terms of protecting the welfare of the defendant or his family. Now, the judge making a point here, noting that this is related to the spread of misinformation, which has been a major part of this case over the last 2 days. Those reading untrue information about the defendant in this case have attended riots, demonstrations demonstrations yesterday in London in order to try to call on the government to make changes to the immigration procedures here in the UK. And these protesters, though, many of them driven by false information being spread online about the immigration status, about the religion, about the intentions and motivations of this defendant, none of which have been made public, and yet misinformation has become rife in that vacuum. So senior police chiefs are meeting with the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer right now to discuss this disorder, to discuss what can be done about the spread of misinformation, and the Prime Minister will be giving giving a speech in about an hour here in the UK to talk to the country about what's happened, the stabbing attacks, yes, but also the disorder which the Prime Minister here has condemned.
Thank you, Stuart, for bringing us up to date. Certainly we'll keep an eye on the tone and the violence that has ensued. Of course, we saw acts of heroism as well, and the community coming together in the aftermath of those violent scenes in Southport in particular. Thank you, Stuart, for joining us. On to other stories. Britain's Foreign and Defence Secretaries have called Lebanon's caretaker Prime Minister Najib Mikati in Beirut. David Lammy, urging parties to respect and implement international resolutions. Defence Secretary John Healey calling for addressing all conflicts through dialogue and diplomatic methods. This meeting, of course, at a pivotal time, coming after a missile struck a building in the south of the capital, killing Hezbollah's senior military commander, which Hezbollah blame on the Israel Defense Forces. Well, Israeli military have confirmed as well on Thursday that the head of Hamas's military wing, Mohammed Deif, was killed in an Israeli airstrike in Gaza last month. The IDF announcing that on July 13th, military fighter jets struck an area of Khan Yunis in which Mohammed Deif was eliminated. He's believed to have been one of the masterminds behind Hamas's October 7th attack on southern Israel, which has sparked, of course, that wider conflict that we've seen between Israel and Hamas. That news following a dramatic few days in which the political leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, was killed in the capital of Iran, Tehran. Again, Iran blaming Israel for that attack. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said he cannot predict the impact of that killing on the ceasefire agreement in Gaza, but he asserted that the ceasefire deal would be reached soon.
I can't predict the effect, the impact of any one event on what comes next. I've learned over many years not to do that. But I think it remains manifestly the case that ceasefire is in the interests of everyone. It's in the interest of Israelis. It's in the interest of Palestinians. It's in the interests of the region. So as long as everyone is focused on what their core interests actually are, I believe that not only will we keep working to reach a deal, we will reach a deal because it is simply imperative that we do so.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken, he's on a visit to Asia. Let's turn our attention to what's been happening within the United States. Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump, former US president of course, has in the past 24 hours questioned whether his rival for the White House, Kamala Harris, is black. Those remarks made during a contentious appearance at the country's largest annual gathering of black journalists on Wednesday. Kamala Harris, whose mother is Indian, whose father is black, is the first black and the first Asian American US Vice President.
I've known her a long time indirectly, not directly very much, and she was always of Indian heritage, and she was only promoting Indian heritage. I didn't know she was black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn black, and now she wants to be known as black. So I don't know, is she Indian or is she black?
The White House has denounced that as insulting, and US Vice President Kamala Harris has hit back directly at Donald Trump, saying that he had put the same old show of divisiveness and disrespect on display.
And we are not going back. We are not going back. We all here remember what those 4 years were like. And today, we were given yet another reminder. This afternoon, Donald Trump spoke at the annual meeting of the National Association of Black Journalists. And it was the same old show. The divisiveness and the disrespect. And let me just say, the American people deserve better.
As I mentioned, further condemnation too from the Biden administration. Here's White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre.
As a person of color, as a black woman who is in this position that is standing before you at this podium behind this lectern, what he just said, what you just read out to me, is repulsive, it's insulting, and, you know, no one has any right to tell someone who they are, how they identify. That is no one's right. It is someone's own decisions. It is, I'll add this, only she can speak to her experience. Only she can speak to what it's like. She's the only person that can do that. And I think it's insulting for anybody. It doesn't matter if it's a former leader, a former president. It is insulting.
More now on a story that broke last night. The Pentagon has approved the guilty pleas of 3 convicts of the September 11th, 2001 attacks. The death sentences of Mohammed Walid bin Attash and Mustafa al-Hawasawi have been converted to life sentences after they pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges for the Twin Towers attempted, I should say, let me start that sentence again, forgive me. They've been converted to life sentences after they pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges for the September 11th attacks. The suspects had been in custody since 2003. Mohammed is the most well-known inmate at the detention facility in Guantanamo Bay, which has been set up by the US since 2002 by then US President George W. Bush on the coast of Cuba to house foreign militant suspects following the September 11th attacks on the United States. To Venezuela, and shops and public transport across the South American nation shut down on Wednesday after tensions continued over President Maduro's controversial win, which the opposition party have dismissed. Amongst international pressure to ensure transparency, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has promised to release all the vote tallies from the disputed weekend election and has said he's asked the top court to force opposition parties to do the same. Meanwhile, international pressure on the government has mounted to release full results, including from regional heavyweights in the United States and Brazil. Russia's announced in past hours that their troops were prepared to shoot down Ukraine's first batch of F-16 fighter jets. The Kremlin added that the F-16 jets will not be a panacea for Kiev's army. On Wednesday, Lithuanian and US officials confirmed that Ukraine had received the first order of the long-awaited jets from Western partners. According to Ukraine, the inclusion of these aircraft will be a significant addition to their air force as they fight back against the Russian invasion. That's it from me here in Washington. Back to you in the studio.
Thank you so much, Benji. That was Benji Hai joining us from Washington, and still to come on DD India Global. Protests are happening in Nigeria. Stay tuned. We'll get you all the details related to it. And a farming robot is making the future of agriculture more sustainable and more easy.
This summer, the world turns its eyes to Paris. And DD India brings you every heartbeat, every victory, and every story. Introducing our special coverage of the Paris Olympics. Experience the passion, the drama, and the triumphs. With exclusive reports, expert analysis, and up-to-the-minute updates. Join us as we bring the spirit of the Olympics to your screens.
Get ready for the ultimate sporting extravaganza on DD India.
DD India presents Champions Day Paris. Only on DD India. Every day at 6:30 p.m. IST, 1 p.m. GMT.
You're watching DD India Global. I am Siddharth Bharadwaj. Thousands of people have taken to the streets in Nigeria to protest what they say has been bad governance by President Tinubu's administration. Police fired tear gas in the capital city Abuja to disperse demonstrators. The protests are taking place amid heavy security presence. Ajak Mangat reports.
Crowds took to the streets despite a last-minute push by the government to stop Nigerians from protesting. The government had feared that the protests would be violent. In the capital, Abuja, protesters defied a court order that restricted them to the National Stadium, but they instead marched through the streets carrying placards with inscriptions like "End Bad Governance" and "Enough is enough" to hunger and hardship. The protesters say economic reforms introduced by President Bola Tinubu have led to economic hardship. In May last year, President Tinubu announced the removal of subsidies on imported petrol, promising that money saved from the subsidies will be used for infrastructural development. However, the removal of the subsidy has led to a sharp rise in fuel prices, which in turn has caused an increase in transportation costs, food prices and overall inflation. This is the first big demonstration by Nigerians since the End SARS movement against police brutality in 2020. Protesters say they will keep demonstrating for the next 10 days until their demands, which include the reversal of a subsidy removal and cutting the cost of governance, are met. Ajak Mangut in Abuja, reporting for DD India.
And news just coming in, a Russian government plane landed in the Turkish capital Ankara on Thursday, shortly after the Turkish National Intelligence Agency said it was coordinating an extensive prisoner swap. It was not clear who was on board the plane, which arrived following signs of a major prisoner exchange involving Russia and Belarus on one side and the United States, Germany and Slovenia on the other. And let's take a look at other stories making news around the world. Diplomats from across the Americas voiced their strong opinions regarding the Venezuelan elections in a charged session at the Organization of American States in Washington. The 35-member regional body said Venezuela's National Election Council had shown itself biased towards the government. Japan is requesting the extradition of a US-Canadian anti-whaling activist who's been held in custody in Greenland since July. Japan was seeking Watson on charges of breaking into a Japanese vessel in the Antarctic Ocean in 2010. A farming robot named Claus is making the future of agriculture more sustainable and more easy. Ag-tech startup Earth Rover's AI-powered farming robot, Claus, has been designed for weeding and crop monitoring, making future farms more sustainable. With commercial availability planned for 2026, it aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the future farms. That's all for this edition of DD India Live, but let us know your thoughts on the news of the day. For those on the go, you can get all the latest news and updates from India and across the world on DD India mobile app. The app is available on both Android and iOS platforms. Scan the QR code on the screen to download now. And we'll be back with more news as it breaks here on DD India. I'm Siddharth Bharadwaj from all of us here in Delhi. Thanks for watching DD India Global.